Today I want to talk a little bit about some consequences of the U.S. electoral system. So first of all, let's talk about what an electoral system is. More specifically, what electoral rules are. Now, electoral rules are how the votes are counted and seats are allocated in a legislature in a democracy, how the executive is chosen in a democracy, and how the contours of the eligible electorates are determined. So all of these together, you might say, form part of our electoral system. First point I want to make is that electoral rules matter. They really matter. Different rules will produce different winners and losers. And of course, different rules will change the strategies that the candidates will try to employ in order to win, right? So you can imagine this is a series of different games, and I've been trying to encourage you to think of politics as a series of games, strategic games. Well, of course, the strategy in one game is not going to be the same as a strategy in any other game. The strategy in poker is not the same thing as a strategy in soccer or in billiards or in baseball, right? Different rules mean the players have to do different things, and this is very true in politics as well. The different rules that you have in place mean that players are going to try and put together different strategies, or different strategies will be optimal in different circumstances. Now, electoral rules function much the same way. So, in the United States, you have this SMD FPTP system, right? Single member district first past the post system. I guess I should recap briefly. SMD FPTP, single member district, that means that we vote in districts, in a series of small districts, and each of those districts returns a single member to Congress, right? That's actually not true for our senatorial districts, right, which are states, and they send 2 members to Congress, so that's a multi-member district. So the Senate is elected in multi-member districts, 2-member districts, and Congress is, or the House of Representatives is elected in a single member district. First past the post simply means that the person with the largest number of votes, the candidate with the largest number of votes, wins the district. It doesn't matter how many votes they have. It just matters that they have more than the next top vote getter. So, single member district, and in order to be that single member, you have to have more votes than the other person. Now, or than any of the other candidates, rather. Now, this affects how congressmen play their strategic games once they get to D.C. So, of course, it affects how they run for office, how they campaign, but it also affects how they vote once they get to Congress. Now, I want to talk about 3 effects that are particularly salient here. 1, the U.S. electoral system exacerbates collective action problems in Congress. 2, the U.S. electoral system encourages pork barrel spending, earmarking, and log rolling. And 3, the U.S. electoral system makes the parties large and moderate. Okay, let's address each of these in turn. So the U.S. electoral system exacerbates collective action problems in Congress. Why? Well, because in order to get legislation passed, a party has to vote together, usually. Sometimes both parties will vote together, but usually one party is going to put its version of legislation forward and try to get all of its members to vote for it. But here's the problem. Here's where the collective action problem comes in. First, no single member's vote is necessary to getting the law passed. That is to say, the law can well pass usually without the vote of many members of the majority party, because typically the majority party has more than 1 vote majority in the House. In the Senate, sometimes, particularly of late, we've seen very close numbers between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate. But in the House, at least, typically no single congressman's vote is necessary. Now, the problem is that sometimes the bill that your party wants to vote for and pass could cost you votes in your district. Now, for example, you might imagine fiscally conservative Republicans in Congress wanting to cut military budgets, for example. They're interested in fiscal discipline. The military is one of the largest items in the budget, so of course that's where some of the spending cuts are going to come from. But of course, there's many members of the Republican Party that represent military districts, like, for instance, Montgomery County, where Austin Peay is located. There are several districts in the United States where military bases play a strong role in the economic life, and those districts are often represented also by Republicans. The dilemma for these Republicans, of course, is that if they vote for the fiscally responsible, balanced budget bill that their party leadership wants to put through, they will cost themselves votes at home, they will cost their district economic growth, and so on and so forth. If bases see their funding diminished, or if they see even their bases closed, that would be extremely bad for their district. And of course, it would be very bad for the electoral future of that particular congressman or woman. So, voting for the bill your party wants may sometimes cost you votes in your district. Of course, we could see the opposite in certain Democratic districts for different sorts of policies. Now, since your vote is not necessary, and it will be potentially risky for you to vote for the bill, you won't vote for it. But of course, if too many members of your party face the same problem, the bill will fail. This is a problem for the party and potentially for the country, right? Why does this happen? Well, what's good for your district or what's good for your political party is not always what's good for the congressman and not necessarily good for the district. So what's good for the country is not necessarily good for your district. What's good for your party is not always good for an individual congressman from that party. This is a classic situation of a collective action problem because the private cost and the social cost of the vote from the congressman are not the same. Because why? Well, because legislators are being elected in districts. And they're not being elected. It's not the case, for instance, that voters vote for a party. Voters vote for in a single national district. No, they vote for representatives in small, discrete, individual districts. So, parties often cannot secure votes from their members if it would seriously harm them in their districts. In other systems, of course, around the world, local politics do not have such a large impact on the ability of a party to achieve national priorities, whether it be spending cuts or overhaul of the healthcare system or what have you. In proportional representation systems, PR systems like those of Germany or perhaps Sweden, parties who aspire to a majority must make the country happy, not a series of local electorates. I want to underline this point, right? If you're voting for a party, not for a candidate, then that party has to get elected, well, basically has to campaign throughout the entire country and is not campaigning a series of districts. So it's the overall country's interest that the party has to capture, not a series of local interests. What that means is that the interest of any single legislator from that party and the interest of the country are likely to be more closely aligned. Okay, there's a second and related effect of this collective action problem in Congress. Because local interests must be appeased in American national politics, spending that benefits local constituencies is often quite necessary in order to bring important congressmen on board with national legislation. This is called pork barrel politics. Pork barrel spending is simply spending at a national level that benefits some local discrete constituency, right? So if a congressman asks for a national flag museum in their district or a Civil War memorial monument in their own district, that's a kind of pork barrel spending. It largely benefits the tourism and employment in that district and doesn't really benefit the country as a whole or doesn't really benefit other districts at any rate. This is what is often called pork barrel spending, and you can see it just about everywhere. National spending that is a giveaway to particular districts. Now, often why this happens, of course, is that local interests must be appeased. You also see things like vote trading, which is informally called log rolling by political scientists. And vote trading is simply a congressman goes up to another congressman and says, okay, you want this bill to be passed, I want this other bill to be passed. If you vote for my bill, I'll vote for your bill. What do you say? Right? That's kind of vote trading. Assuming that the congressman doesn't think that the bill that he's going to vote for or she's going to vote for is going to hurt them terribly in their district, they might go ahead and agree to the trade. Finally, you also tend to see a kind of pork barrel spending, which is spending on national bills being directed by law towards the districts of influential congressmen. This is called earmarking, right? So when funds are earmarked for a particular district, what this means, or what usually happened, was, for instance, that the government decided that, I don't know, let's imagine that they wanted to create a new Center for Disease Control building, right? So this is an important national priority. We want to prevent the spread of infectious diseases like the Zika virus, or Asian bird flu, or Ebola, you name it, right? Contagious disease, the prevention of contagious diseases is pretty clearly a public good, for reasons that actually you should think about when you think about what public good actually is. And so it's spending of national benefit, but of course that CDC building has to be put somewhere, right? Now, there's two ways of making that decision. One, you could ask the CDC. You could say, okay, where do you need to be? What would be the best for you? So you ask, members of the CDC or the leaders, whoever's in charge of that agency, where to put their new building. Of course, Congress might decide that political imperatives override this sort of technical imperative. So they might decide, well, in order to get this bill passed, or in order to get some other bill passed that we want, we'd better make sure this new construction and all these jobs go to and all this tax revenue go to a particular state or a particular district, right? Usually that district or state will be the district or state of someone who's influential on the sort of committee that is needed to get this bill that they want passed. And so that's a kind of earmarking, right? Okay, so, and earmarking is presumably less bad than pork barrel spending, in the sense that the spending is needed. It's got to be spent somewhere, but it's spent somewhat inefficiently because it's spent for political reasons rather than economic or efficiency-oriented reasons. Okay, moving forward. We often don't like pork barrel politics. We don't like it that congressmen withhold their vote in favor of necessary legislation until they get some special favor or giveaway. But I want to encourage you to think about how else you would get these people to vote for the bill, right? This is made possible, and I think this is made necessary by our electoral rules. After all, put yourself in their shoes. Would you harm your own electoral chances by voting for a bill in Congress where your vote wasn't strictly necessary to pass the bill? It's not only the case that, you're deciding to put your own private electoral interests ahead of the party's. The party might want to see you get reelected, by the way, but let's say that, you're greedy and you want to put yourself in front of your party. That's bad, true. But it's not even the case that you'd be sacrificing yourself by voting for the bill. You'd be sacrificing yourself for a common good because your vote might not be necessary. The majority is not necessarily won. Why can't everybody else vote for the bill? You can abstain or vote against it. Everybody wins, right? You don't lose any votes, and the party gets what it wants. After all, would you demand something? Wouldn't you, in their position, demand some form of compensation for your district to make up for the harm that this bill might do to your constituents? It seems to me that you probably would. And so from that, in this view, in this optic, viewed from this perspective, it's not so clear that pork barrel politics are a bad thing. Or rather, it seems to me that it's the way to grease the wheels, or the way to make Congress work, given that there's a conflict between the private interest of congressmen and the national interest, or the interest of the party at the very least. There's a conflict between group interest and private interest. That's a collective action problem. That collective action problem leads to mechanisms to deal with it, and one mechanism is pork barrel politics. Not the only one, but it's a possible one. Okay, a third effect of our electoral system has to do with the kinds of policies that parties will tend to espouse during a general election campaign season. The strategies employed by different parties are going to depend on the electoral system. It turns out, and if you've looked at politics of other countries, that parties across the world stand for very, very different sorts of things, and not just because different issues come up in different countries, but because different electoral systems encourage different kinds of ideological strategies in order to get elected. So in first past the post system like ours, parties have to get, well, to be sure of getting the seat, they have to win 50% or more of the seats, right? 50% of the vote plus one vote in order to win the election. They can win with less, it's true, but typically, to be sure, they have to win at least half the votes plus one. Now, this means that they have to be fairly moderate, right, if they want to win. In list PR systems, in other types of systems where you vote for a party, parties don't necessarily need to be moderate. If they get 5% of the vote nationally, they might well get 5% of the seats in the legislature. But that's not the case. If you get 5% of the seats nationally in the United States, you can easily get 0 seats in the legislature, particularly if those votes are all distributed across the country. Okay, so parties have to be fairly moderate if they want to win. Why is that? Let's think about it, right? The median voter theorem simply says that if you can capture the middle voter, you can capture enough votes to win in a two-way election. Why is that? Well, imagine that we line up all the voters in a row from left to right ideologically, right? From the most left-wing Marxist to the most right-wing reactionary, right? You line the votes up from left to right. And if you're a candidate and you're looking at all these voters lined in a row, you have to decide how to win the election. Well, in order to win the election, you have to try to minimize, let's say, the ideological distance between you and 50% plus one vote. Now, in order to do that, it turns out that the optimal strategy is to position yourself near the middle, right? Very near the middle. Because what we're going to assume here is that people will always vote for the candidate that is closest to them ideologically. And as long as the other candidate is on the other side of the middle from you, you can get everybody from the most extreme to that middle point, right? So in order to minimize the ideological distance between yourself and your voters, you have to put yourself near the middle. And of course, both candidates are going to put themselves near the middle. So what this means is that in national elections in the United States, for presidential elections particularly, what you see is that the candidates position themselves where they believe the national median voter is, and they end up being usually quite close to one another. Their policies end up sounding very similar. Now, note that in order to win a political primary, the calculus is very different. To win the Republican primary, the candidate has to put themselves near the median Republican voter. The median Republican voter is, of course, much more right-wing than the median national voter. And, of course, the median Democratic voter that the Democratic candidate has to win is much to the left of the median national voter. So, unsurprisingly, during primary season, candidates tend to be more separated ideologically to the left and to the right, and then once the nominees have been decided upon, the general election season comes into play, then everybody, of course, moves to the center in order to capture the national median voter. It gets a little more complicated than that, I guess, because we don't vote as a country as a whole. We vote in our states, getting electoral votes. So technically, each candidate is going to have to try to tailor his or her message to the median voter in the swing states that are likely to decide the election. There will be a number of states that will reliably go Republican or Democrat no matter what happens, more or less. And then, of course, there's those swing states where the vote is likely to be close, states like Ohio and Florida and Michigan and Pennsylvania, states that tend to be pretty close. The median voter in those states is actually going to have a pretty strong influence on where the candidate is going to take his or her ideological positions, because those voters are the ones that need to be won if the overall election is to go their way. So that's the median voter theorem. A related political science theorem or law is Duverger's law. And this is another way in which the electoral rules affect how parties play this political game. And the incentive is going to be to form large parties capable of winning over a majority of the voters. We said that a candidate had to get 50% plus one of the vote in order to win an election. Well, parties have to get 50% plus one of the seats in Congress or the Senate in order to get their legislation or their agenda passed. And what that means, of course, is that you have to form a large party. A small party is not going to get it done unless you can reliably caucus with another party. So In a two-party system, what that means is that you want to be a large party. You want to be able to win districts, and you want to be able to pass legislation once you get to Congress. There's not much point in being a small party in the United States. Now, there are other countries where it's okay to be a small party. There's no problem being a small. In fact, being a small party might make you very influential because you might be the arbiter between two other larger parties. We see this a lot in Switzerland. We've seen it in Germany, even in the UK. When you have, well, the idea is, of course, that in those countries, UK accepted, voting for a small party can still produce rewards for you as a voter, in the sense that if your party gets 10% of the vote, they can get 10% of the seats through a proportional allocation of seats. In the United States, you have to win districts, which means you have to win 50% in districts. Again, that encourages the formation of parties that can do that can capture 50% of the vote. A corollary, so you have to cater to a large number of voters. In order to cater to a large number of voters, you have to be moderate. That's the median voter theorem. So in the United States and countries like the United States, you tend to see large parties, typically two large parties. A corollary of this is that politicians who want to get elected don't join small parties, even if they in private agree with some non-mainstream views. If you want to make politics your profession, at least in the United States, you need to join a large party, and in order to do that, you have to some degree, agree with the party platform of the large party, and so you have to moderate your views. Well, or at least some of the time you have to moderate your views. All right, let's conclude. So in conclusion, many features of our national politics trace back to our choice of electoral rules. Our electoral rules create collective action problems for parties in Congress trying to get legislation passed. This leads directly to the practices of log rolling, earmarking, and pork barreling that Americans love to hate, but the parties have to try to coordinate in order to get congressmen on board with their party platform. And our electoral rules tend to make our parties large, that's Duverger's law, and moderate, that's our median voter theorem.